Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. For years, the world has talked about India's potential to serve as a global manufacturing hub, as a potential tech superpower, and as an influencer on the global stage. But India struggled to unleash that potential. A slow bureaucracy and a lack of risk-taking appetite held India back. But today, India is turning a corner. The much-awaited decoupling from China is finally underway. Big businesses are moving out and they're placing their bets on India. Tonight, we'll tell you the story of Foxconn, the world's biggest tech manufacturer. It is moving out of China and setting up manufacturing hubs in India. Foxconn's investment could propel India as a leading destination for tech manufacturing. Meanwhile, India's soft power too is growing. This week, New Delhi has demonstrated that through two events, the festival of Holi and a cricket match. We've put together a special report for you today. You don't want to miss this. The headlines first. Russia fires over 80 missiles at cities across Ukraine. Airstrikes lead to blackouts in many parts of the country, including the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. President Zelensky slams what he calls Moscow's miserable tactics. Georgia's government buckles under pressure. The ruling party says it is halting plans to introduce the controversial foreign agent bill after mass protests. Critics say the law would be similar to Russian legislation used to crack down on dissent. But protests are still on in Greece. Police fire tear gas at firebomb-throwing protesters outside Parliament. Thousands continue to demonstrate, demand the Prime Minister's resignation of the country's worst rail tragedy. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Australian counterpart Anthony Albanese watch a cricket match between the two countries in Gujarat. Prime Minister Albanese is on a 4-day trip to India to strengthen trade, defence and economic ties and discuss ways to counter China. And a man in Thailand is sent to jail for 2 years for selling a calendar featuring rubber ducks. The prosecution said it was an insult to the king. Rubber ducks were used in a mass protest against the monarchy a few years back. This is a story of India's rise. India is emerging as a major electronics manufacturer. As businesses look to decouple from China, it is advantage India. Case in point, Foxconn. Foxconn is the world's largest tech manufacturer, also the backbone of China's manufacturing industry. Foxconn is basically a Taiwanese company. But it has become synonymous with China's vast factory towns, like the iPhone city in Zhengzhou. Now, Foxconn is quickly trying to shed that reputation. It is moving to India. In fact, it already has facilities in India, a plant near the southern city of Chennai. Right now, it makes around 10 million iPhones. Going forward, Foxconn wants to double this. It wants to make around 20 million iPhones in India. The expansion should be complete by 2024. The company also plans to triple its workforce. 100,000 workers will eventually work in this factory. And this may just be the beginning. Foxconn is planning more facilities in India. 2 Indian states are in contention, Karnataka and Telangana. Again, they're in southern India. Recently, top executives of Foxconn were in India. It was a high-powered team led by the chairman of the company, Young Liu. Letters of intent have been signed. The company is said to be planning a plant near Bengaluru. It is India's IT hub. Reports say this facility will make parts for the iPhone. It could serve other purposes too, like contributing towards Foxconn's electric vehicle business, again through the manufacturing of parts. How much will Foxconn spend on this plant? Around $700 million, according to one report. And this is still work in progress. Formal agreements are yet to be sealed, so we have to see how it pans out. And electronics manufacturing is just one aspect. Foxconn also wants to build semiconductors in India. There are plans to set up factories for computer chips. And for this, the Taiwanese company has tied up with Vedanta. Vedanta is India's natural resources conglomerate. The facility could be set up in the state of Gujarat. So this expansion is wide-ranging. But why should this get so much attention? Why is Foxconn's move so significant? Because Foxconn is a tech manufacturing giant. It makes 70% of all iPhones, 70% of all iPhones, and 40% of all consumer electronics in the world. That's how big this company is. And that is why its India expansion is being seen as a vote of confidence. It could propel India into the big league. Also, why is it happening now? Because now the conditions are right. For companies looking to move away from China, India meets the requirements. India has a young workforce. There is availability of talent of all kinds. The government of India is offering attractive incentives. And most importantly, India is just a better place to be in. China, as of today, is geopolitical kryptonite. It is the target of American sanctions, which makes manufacturing in China quite tough. The US has imposed sweeping export curbs on China, and for any business, that is reason to worry. Even the prospect of sanctions raises risks for businesses, which is why companies like Foxconn have to diversify. Then there's the unpredictability of the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. It's difficult to deal with for any business. Communist Party diktats and frequent crackdowns have forced a rethink. Companies do not like an unstable business environment, which is why they're leaving China. The idea of decoupling was floated when the pandemic began. Initially, it was not taken seriously, but China's erratic policies have made diversification a necessity for most now. And India seems to be making the most of the available opportunities. It could do better, though. Businesses still face some tough challenges in India, like the lack of available infrastructure. Then there's the skill set challenge. India has a reputation of being a software powerhouse, but it still has a long way to go in developing its own native tech manufacturing capabilities. You see, putting together parts to make an iPhone is one thing. Developing the technology from scratch is quite another. And that should be the next step for India. And India still has some catching up to do in this department. Look at this report from February. Apple wants to develop an AR device. AR is augmented reality. It's a technology that enhances the real-world environment for the user. And guess who Apple has tabbed for this? Again, it's a Chinese contract manufacturer. So China might be on the back foot, but it's still not out of the game. And India is off to a good start, but there's still a long way to go. Economic might, like military might, is part of a country's hard power, and India is working to strengthen both. India has more hard power today than ever before. But what about soft power? That too is on the rise. In fact, India's soft power story is an amazing one. But before I tell you that story, let me show you some images from the city of Ahmedabad today. It's the capital of Gujarat, Prime Minister Modi's home state. Take a look at this. You can see Indian Prime Minister Modi with his Australian counterpart Anthony Albanese. They're waving to cheering crowds at the Motera Stadium, now called the Narendra Modi Stadium. India is leading the 4-match test series 2-1. The Australian Prime Minister is visiting India and celebrating 75 years of cricket friendship. This is being called cricket diplomacy. Just before this, the headline spoke of Holi diplomacy, again featuring the Australian Prime Minister. Yesterday, the US Secretary of Commerce was seen dancing with India's Defence Minister. In another event, diplomats from various missions were seen shaking a leg at the Holi party of Meenakshi Lekhi. She's the Junior Minister for External Affairs. What do these images tell you? This is much more than song and dance. This is world leaders celebrating Indian culture. This is diplomacy and a testament to India's rising soft power. When India became independent, it only had soft power, no military. Indians were seen as a people who ousted the mighty British on the strength of their moral force. India used the richness of its culture to compensate for its hard power deficiencies. It became a crusader against imperial forces, an opponent of war. and a spokesperson of other post-colonial countries. In the post-Nehru era, India tried to acquire hard power. With the nuclear test of 1974 and the imposition of emergency in 1975, India lost the moral high ground taken by Gandhi. By 1998, when India declared itself a nuclear state, its soft power had eroded significantly. But today's India is different. Today's India is not ready to trade one form of power for another. India's hard power has grown along with its soft power. India is among the fastest growing economies in the world's biggest arms importer, with a space mission to the moon and Mars. At the same time, India is a vocal champion of the global south. It is calling for United Nations reform, contributing to peacekeeping missions, exporting wheat to the world, providing vaccines and medicines. Today's India is confident about its identity and place in the world. It can draw from its civilizational richness and promote yoga and Ayurveda. It can also flex its military muscle and conduct surgical strikes in Pakistan. And the cherry on the cake, India dominates the originally British sport of cricket. It is central. India is central to the global cricket economy. The Indian board, BCCI, is the richest cricket board in the world by a mile. The net worth of the International Cricket Council, the governing body of cricket, is said to be a little over $2.5 billion. Compare this with the net worth of just the BCCI, $2.25 billion. The next richest cricket board is Australia. It's worth $70 million. You see the gap. If the Indian Cricket Board is doing well, our players are doing even better. Indian players hold some of the top records in the world. Sachin Tendulkar holds the records for the most international matches, maximum career runs, maximum number of centuries. Who can forget his 100 hundreds? Our current captain, Rohit Sharma, holds the record for the highest individual ODI score. His predecessor, Virat Kohli, has a few accolades to his name as well. He has the most runs in T20 internationals. Kohli also holds the record for scoring the maximum runs in a single IPL season. IPL is the Indian Premier League. It is the most watched format of the sport. In the entire history of cricket, only 3 bowlers have bagged all the wickets in an innings. One of them is India's former captain and coach, Anil Kumble, who sent the entire Pakistani team packing in 1999. India is the undisputed cricket superpower, and these images are proof. It's not a coincidence that world leaders are making a beeline to India. This year is going to be packed with diplomatic events and high-profile visits. It will mean a lot of work, but also reason to celebrate. We're wrapping up with these images of the Indian cricket team celebrating Holi. And now let's talk about the United States. It calls India its strategic partner. It is getting ready to host the Indian Prime Minister this summer for a state visit. But there's a gaping hole in this relationship. 2 years into the Biden presidency, the United States still does not have an ambassador in India. Why is that? It's because Biden's pick is controversial, and he's adamant about having his way. We are talking about a man called Eric Garcetti. He's the former mayor of Los Angeles. His tenure was riddled with scandals. His case has been held up since the day it was proposed. But Joe Biden refuses to explore alternatives. He keeps coming back to Garcetti for some reason. In January, the United States president overlooked the scandals and re-nominated Garcetti for the post of the U.S. ambassador to India. And now the man is one step closer towards securing the job. A key panel of lawmakers has signed off on the nomination. But it's not a done deal yet. In the next step, Garcetti's candidacy will be put to vote. And it looks like he finally has the support he needs. So he may eventually come. But the whole saga has cast a shadow on the Biden administration's India strategy. From the day it was announced, the choice of Garcetti was a lost opportunity. The choice of the ambassador could have been a statement. It could have communicated America's intent to deepen ties with India, but Team Biden refuses to learn from their mistakes. Garcetti remains a controversial pick, but Biden continues to back him. And why is he controversial? It's because of a sexual harassment scandal. It happened when he was still the mayor of Los Angeles. One of Garcetti's top aides, Rick Jacobs, faced accusations of sexual harassment. A lawsuit was filed, and the mayor insisted he had no idea about this. But an investigation found otherwise. It said it was highly unlikely, and I'm quoting from what the investigation found, it was highly unlikely that Garcetti was unaware of what was going on. The probe was led by a Republican senator. These claims have damaged Garcetti's candidature. He is believed to be close to Joe Biden. Apparently, he was in the running for a cabinet position. But the Rick Jacobs controversy derailed that. It also scuttled his bid for ambassadorship. And that's not all. Like I told you before, Garcetti served as the mayor of Los Angeles. Let's look at some of the highlights of his tenure there. When he was in office, one city council member was sent to prison. This was in a corruption case. Another former deputy mayor faced a bribery trial. And there are more like him. A former head of the Water and Power Department pleaded guilty in a different bribery case. Garcetti's own chief of staff was caught up in a scandal. He was sent on leave for several months. This was over some insulting social media posts. And all of this happened when Garcetti was still in office. We must point out here that he is not personally linked to any of these cases. But America's second largest city was mired in scandals under him, and it does raise questions about his leadership. What kind of office was he running? During his tenure, the reputation of the Los Angeles government was tarnished, and people lost faith in the leadership. So when the US picks their top diplomat for their strategic partner like India, is Eric Garcetti the best they can do? Is he the best choice? Has President Biden sacrificed the best interest of this relationship to push for his candidate? Like I said, the position of the US ambassador has been vacant for 2 years now, and this is the longest gap ever. The last time something like this happened was in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president. It took 16 months for the US to send their ambassador to India. Then Thomas Pickering, the last ambassador, left his post in March 1993. He was replaced by Frank Wisner in July 1994. But in Biden's case, it has been over 24 months and counting. India still doesn't have a US ambassador, which puts India in the same bracket as countries like Azerbaijan, Cambodia, Ecuador, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Zimbabwe, just to name a few. As of December 2022, as many as 20 ambassadorial nominations were still pending. And Indian officials are not happy with the way this case has been handled. There is no continuity or stability. American officials say this affair has become an embarrassment. Senator Mark Warner, chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, said, and I'm quoting, "It is an embarrassment that we say this is one of the most valuable relationships in the world, and yet we've not appointed an ambassador." And while India waits for an ambassador, who manages the US mission in India in the meantime? The charge d'affaires. Usually, it's an American diplomat. In the last 2 years, multiple American diplomats have served on this post. So there is no continuity. And again, this is supposedly one of the most important allies of the US we're talking about. Biden has called India a quote-unquote indispensable partner, an important relationship, but he's not been able to find a top diplomat to serve in India. Would the US administration treat its other allies the same way? Can it go without an ambassador in Brussels, for instance, or Paris or London? And this is not to question Washington's commitment. They need India on their side. And India is perhaps one of the few partners that enjoys bipartisan support in the US Congress. But in the case of the missing ambassador, surely Team Biden could have done better. Our next story is about the changing power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. Australia is getting nuclear submarines. A high-stakes meeting is scheduled for next week. The US is going to host it in San Diego. It's an AUKUS meet. Now, what is AUKUS? It's a group of 3 countries, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. AUKUS, AUKUS. President Joe Biden Prime Ministers Rishi Sunak and Anthony Albanese will all attend this meeting. Now, for all practical purposes, AUKUS is a grouping aimed at China. Washington, London and Canberra say they're working together to preserve the sanctity of the international law in the Indo-Pacific. And to that end, Australia is all set to get nuclear submarines. These will add to Canberra's naval prowess. But China is not impressed, and for obvious reasons. First, let's tell you what Australia is eyeing. 5 nuclear submarines. It hopes to get them in a decade. And these will all be provided by the United States. The deal is expected to be announced next week. The US is looking to sell its Virginia-class nuclear submarines to Australia. These are America's latest fast-track submarines. They can employ a variety of weapons, including torpedoes and cruise missiles. And they're also capable of carrying out intelligence gathering and reconnaissance missions. Reports say the United Kingdom has also scored a big win here. The UK and Australia will work jointly to develop a next-generation nuclear submarine. This project could stretch well into the 2040s. Until then, the American Virginia-class submarines will act as a stopgap. Next question. Why does Australia need nuclear submarines? Also, what are nuclear submarines? They're nuclear powered, they run on nuclear power, but they do not necessarily carry nuclear weapons, and it's important to make that distinction. These are nuclear powered submarines. They may or may not have nuclear weapons. Now, running on nuclear fuel has many advantages. Conventional submarines are diesel powered. They have to come out of water. They have to surface quite frequently to consume oxygen. But that's not the case with nuclear submarines. These beasts can stay underwater for extremely long periods of time. How does that help? It makes these submarines more stealthy. It makes their detection very difficult. Not many countries in the world today have nuclear submarines. It's a small and rather exclusive club of 6 nations: the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, India, France and China. 6 countries. By 2030, Australia could join this club, and it's very happy about it. Here's what Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had to say about this.
This will be the single biggest leap in our defence capability in our history. AUKUS is about much more than nuclear submarines or even technological interoperability. AUKUS is about the future. It further formalises the common values and the shared interests that our 3 nations have in preserving peace and upholding the rules and institutions that secure our region and our world.
Australia wasn't always supposed to get nuclear submarines. Earlier, it had a deal with France. It was supposed to buy a dozen diesel-powered conventional submarines. But in 2021, Australia scrapped that deal. Almost immediately, the AUKUS alliance was announced. Its primary agenda was to sell nuclear submarines to Australia. Of course, the French were not happy about it. In fact, French President Macron's government said it had been backstabbed. This was a decade-old submarine deal that Canberra had tore up. You could say it had compelling reasons to do this. Tensions between Australia and China were soaring. China had weaponized trade and sought to punish Australia. And why did China want to punish Australia? Because Australia asked for an investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it made China very angry. In fact, whenever countries utter the words COVID-19 and origins in the same breath, China tends to fly off the handle. No prizes for guessing why. And its aggression across the Indo-Pacific is well documented. From the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean and the Taiwan Strait, Beijing's expansionism continues. Australia wants to be able to counter that. So when the US and UK offered not just nuclear submarines, but also technology to Australia, it was too good an offer to be turned down. And China's reaction has been predictable. Listen to this.
United States, the United Kingdom and Australia to carry out and continue to promote nuclear submarine cooperation poses a serious nuclear proliferation risk, intensifies the arms race and undermines regional peace and stability. China is gravely concerned about this and firmly objects to it. The relevant cooperation among the 3 countries has also raised increasing international concerns.
China has at least 6 nuclear submarines in its arsenal. And the US is willing to provide 5 such submarines to Australia in the next 10 years. Also the UK. it could also lease 2 Astute-class nuclear submarines to Australia. So that's 7 nuclear subs right there, as opposed to China's 6 at the moment. And that should tell you why China is panicking. It will obviously try to increase its fleet, but the Indo-Pacific is changing for sure. Australia will join India in having nuclear submarines. The US and the UK are not shy of deploying their own submarines in the region. The scales are slowly but surely tilting, and they're not tilting in China's favor. Now let's turn to Israel. The protests against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial overhaul plan have found some new recruits, members of Israel's defense forces. You heard that right. Members of Israel's military are threatening to not show up for training in protest. 10 former Israel Air Force chiefs have warned that the Prime Minister's overhaul poses quote-unquote grave and tangible dangers. Other military leaders have said that there's a real risk of civil war in Israel. The Prime Minister has hit out, saying there's room for debate, but no room for insubordination.
Israel is protesting. Thousands are out in the streets. The protesters are calling it a day of resistance. The demonstrations were enough to affect the visit of Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin. He had to meet Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu near the Ben Gurion airport because of the chaos. And it isn't just ordinary citizens marching against Netanyahu. The Israeli military is getting involved. There's threat of a full-blown civil war. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is at the center of this storm. He's facing massive backlash over his plan to overhaul the judiciary. The army's involvement is a matter of concern. Israel's military is perhaps its most sacred institution. Most citizens have to go through mandatory military service. Now, there's dissent in the ranks. Reservists are threatening to not go for training. Former military chiefs say there could be a civil war. The Prime Minister has hit back.
It rests on the deep understanding that whatever the differences between us, we are always united in the face of those who seek to kill us. This was the case throughout all of Israel's wars, regardless of the struggles and disagreements among us. Refusal threatens this existential foundation. In a public struggle, there is room for protest, there is room for disagreements, for expressing opinions, but there is no room for refusal.
So what are the proposed changes and why have they triggered this protest? Presently, judges are chosen by a committee made up of politicians, judges and lawyers. Netanyahu wants to change that. He wants a bigger say in selecting judges. Critics say he would handpick loyalists, and an independent judiciary will cease to exist. It has happened elsewhere, like in the US. Judicial appointments are political. A Republican-heavy Supreme Court ruled against abortion and curbed fundamental human rights for American women. Israelis don't want this repeated in their country. Plus, their Prime Minister is on trial for corruption. So a judiciary favorable to him may influence cases against him. The government also wants the ability to overturn Supreme Court rulings. Critics say this is an attempt to scrap all checks and balances and drag Israel towards authoritarianism. Netanyahu and his allies say the judiciary needs to be reined in, that they're unelected, yet they interfere in politics, and that judicial activism is what's actually undermining Israel's democracy. But the protesters continue to swell in ranks. Just yesterday, on International Women's Day, thousands of Israeli women wore red in protest. They formed a human chain, a symbolic red line that Netanyahu shouldn't cross.
For 9 weeks, we are protesting against the legislation of this new government that's going to harm the Supreme Court. Today is the International Women's Day. It's supposed to be a happy day that we celebrate our rights, but now we need to protest again. We all wear red, and we show that we are drawing a red line, and we will not allow this government to harm our rights.
The overhaul has passed one round of scrutiny at the Knesset, Israel's parliament. It still has to go through more rounds before it becomes law. That could take months. In the meantime, could Israel see a compromise? According to former defense chief, retired army general and opposition leader Benny Gantz, that doesn't seem likely.
There won't be a negotiation until the legislation is halted. We won't concede on our values and we won't compromise on our democracy. Agreements can be reached. Compromise on democracy, we cannot reach.
Meanwhile, China is recalibrating. Its diplomats are striking a different tone. China has a new foreign minister, and he doesn't want to be known as a wolf warrior. Qin Gang says he wants to dance with the wolves instead. Consider what he said, and I'm quoting, "China's diplomacy has enough kindness and benevolence. But when wolves are getting in our way and start attacking, Chinese diplomats must dance with the wolves to defend the country." Let me repeat. That's a Chinese diplomat lecturing the world about kindness and benevolence. What does the statement mean? Dancing with the wolves. What is the new Chinese foreign minister trying to convey here? Instead of hitting back, Qin is trying to paint China as the victim. Instead of being called a wolf warrior, he's suggesting that it is China that is under attack. The term wolves here is in reference to the US and its allies, and the minister is trying to convey that China is surrounded by them. And this is a clear shift. Instead of a sharp-tongued, rage-induced, combative diplomacy, Chinese diplomats are adopting a softer tone. The shift began in January with the demotion of Zhao Lijian. He made a name for himself thanks to his combative approach. It earned him the nickname Wolf Warrior in Chief. And what contributed to his rise also led to his downfall. Zhao was the spokesperson of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now he's been pulled out of the spotlight. Do you know what his new role is? He works for the Department of Boundary and Ocean Affairs. It's a relatively obscure department, and that's an understatement. The message, though, is clear. The wolf warriors have been put on a leash, and the reasons are obvious. The Communist Party faces serious domestic challenges. The Chinese economy needs a revival, so Beijing wants to reduce points of friction. The next step is to revive diplomatic engagement. It began with the German Chancellor's visit to Beijing last year. Xi Jinping sat down with Olaf Scholz. China is trying to woo Europe again. Because the European Union is the biggest trading bloc in the world. It accounts for around 15% of the world's imports and exports. And China is the largest exporter of goods. It wants to retain that title. So Europe is a good place to start. More European leaders are expected to visit China soon, like French President Emmanuel Macron. And going by some claims, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni too. Beijing is making an outreach in the Indo-Pacific as well. Earlier this month, the Chinese foreign minister was in India. Qin Gang visited New Delhi for a G20 meeting. He met with External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. China has tried to repair ties with Australia too. In December, the Australian Foreign Affairs Minister paid a visit to Beijing. So the focus is very much on engagement, on reviving engagement. Chinese diplomats have new orders. They're now talking to their counterparts rather than talking at them. But some things have not changed, like Beijing's animosity towards Washington. With the US, China maintains the same wolf warrior approach, and it flows from the top. This week, Xi Jinping slammed the United States. He said the US was trying to suppress China. Then the Chinese foreign minister chimed in. He said Washington should change its attitude or risk conflict with China.
The United States claims to be competing to win against China rather than seeking conflict. But in fact, the United States' so-called competition is total containment and suppression, a zero-sum game in which you die and I live.
And some things never change. Can the dragon stop breathing fire? We'll have to wait and see. The map of our world is about to change. And I'm not talking about China breaching boundaries. I'm talking about the continent of Africa splitting into two. It's being predicted now. An entirely new ocean could emerge in the African continent. Reports say 2 sections of Africa, of the continent, have started to move apart. And this change is associated with the East African Rift System. It's one of the largest rifts in the world. And the split, if it happens, like any other process in geology, could take millions of years. But how will it change our world? Here's a report.
Our planet is ever-changing, and one such major change is expected in Africa. The continent will be split, quite literally. And there could be a new ocean in the making. We are talking of the East African Rift. It has been developing for 22 million years. Yes, you heard us right, 22 million years. It extends over thousands of kilometers through countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda. What is this rift? Rifts are valleys or lowland regions. They form when the Earth's tectonic plates move apart. And why does this happen? Because the irregularly shaped tectonic plates are constantly in motion. In 2018, a sudden large crack appeared in Kenya. It caused immense destruction, including a highway collapse. Initial theories linked it to the East African Rift. But the two sides of the crack did not have the same outline, like trying to join two pieces of a puzzle that don't belong together. Later, it was discovered that this was most likely caused by soil erosion. Now, many are speculating that the possible split in Africa could be connected to the same rift. Experts suggest that two major sections of the continent are already moving apart. This could eventually lead to a new body of water between them. But fret not, you won't be around to witness it. Why? Because it could take 10 million years to fully form. And how will it change Africa? Landlocked countries like Uganda and Zambia could have their very own coastlines. If the crack in Kenya garnered attention in 2018, in 2005, it was Ethiopia which was in the news. That's when a 56-kilometer-long crack appeared in its deserts. Researchers say this could have been the beginning of the formation of the water body we are talking about now. Believe it or not, this has happened before. Tectonic shifts were major factors in the creation of many regions we see today. The Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden between East Africa and West Asia were created like this. The Himalayas were created in the same fashion when India and Eurasia collided. The story of the evolution of our planet is a fascinating one. Mountains, seas, and entire new continents are created over millions of years. The next big change is coming in Africa. 2 continents and a new ocean. This story is just beginning. But the shift is clear, both above and below the Earth's surface.
Our next story is both horrifying and sickening. And we warn you, it isn't for the faint of heart. In South Korea, a man has been found with over 1,000 dead dogs in his house. The 60-year-old man starved these dogs to death and left them to rot. He said his victims were abandoned animals. But why would he starve them and kill them? Our next report has some answers.
Over 1,000 dogs murdered. Starved to death. Let that sink in. A man in South Korea killed them and left them to rot in his yard. He locked them in cages, sacks, and rubber boxes. Their decayed bodies even created a layer of putrid mass on the ground. The 60-year-old has reportedly been murdering dogs since 2020. Only now has he been caught. The murderer's lair is in South Korea's Yangpyeong County. A local stumbled upon this killing field by accident while looking for his own lost dog. The police were then called in to arrest the dog murderer. When interrogated, the man said he was killing abandoned dogs. But animal rights groups think it's actually a business, that the man was being paid to dispose of dogs by breeders. They say once a dog got too old to breed, the man was paid about 10,000 won, or $8 to take care of them. Only 4 dogs survived the ordeal. They were rushed to intensive care. 2 of the animals are in critical condition. South Korea has laws about animal cruelty. It's punishable by about 3 years in prison or a $23,000 fine. But it seems this wasn't enough to deter the 60-year-old from killing hundreds of animals. The report brings to focus the plight of pets, especially after the pandemic. Across the world, pets are being abandoned. Some because their owners cannot afford to keep them. Some because people who bought pets at the work-from-home peak have realized that they don't have the time to take care of them. In South Korea itself, about 130,000 pets are abandoned each year. Only about 1 in 10 pets get to live with their owners till they die. This is according to data from the Korean Animal Welfare Association and Korea's Animal and Plant Quarantine Agency. Many of these animals have to be euthanized. And it seems they find their way to people like the Yangpyeong dog murderer. Even when they aren't abandoned, more and more animals are being subjected to cruelty. In South Korea, animal abuse cases rose from 69 to 914 between 2010 and 2019. Reports say Asia is the worst place in the world in terms of animal cruelty. Animals are being caged up to be smuggled and transported, some piled up in cages, one above the other, in wet markets. Not to mention just physical violence inflicted on pets. Millions of animals suffer and not enough is being done about it. In India, there's a 50 rupee fine for animal cruelty. 50 rupees, that's about 60 cents. How on earth is that an effective deterrent? Laws across the world need to be modernized. Because while a dog is a man's best friend, man might sometimes turn out to be a dog's worst enemy.
This week we talked about gender equality and how it will take 300 years to achieve it. For our last story today, we have something that looks like a step forward in the right direction. For the first time in history, women are represented in every parliament around the world. Now, this is based on data from 47 countries that held elections last year. Women took about 26% of the available seats. In simpler terms, 1 in 4 lawmakers worldwide are now women. 1 in 4, which does not sound like very much, but we'll take a win where we can, even if it's a small win. It's a 2% increase from the previous year. And it's up from 1 in 5 women lawmakers in the year 2011. So now let's ask the golden question. How was this achieved? And we found that there was one decisive factor, quotas. They seem to have worked. When quotas, either legislative or voluntary, required a minimum number of female candidates, around 31% of women were elected to parliament. In countries with no quotas, women representation was about 21%. And this was not the only factor. Some others were also at play, like increased awareness of discrimination and attention to gender-sensitive and family-friendly policies due to COVID. But 26% is the average number. There were variations across the world. The Americas had the maximum growth, about 35%. And some countries showed significant progress, like Australia. They have a historic record, about 57% seats won by women in the Senate in Australia. In other regions, growth stalled, like in Europe. Women's representation remained at 31% in 15 European countries. This has largely been the trend since 2017. What about Asia? Wide divides characterized outcomes in Asia. Senate in Japan saw record numbers of women elected, which is quite the feat, because this has historically been a male-dominated area in Japan. Meanwhile, India, the world's most populous democracy, remained in the lowest quartile in the world, with less than 3% increase. Big or small, growth in women's parliamentary representation is now a worldwide phenomenon. The question is it enough? What about gender parity? Well, that remains an elusive goal. Only 6 countries in the world have achieved it so far. They have an equal number of men and women in parliament. These countries are New Zealand, Cuba, Mexico, Nicaragua, Rwanda, and the United Arab Emirates. At the current rate, it could take 80 years for the rest of the world to catch up. What's stopping this from happening? Sexism, harassment, violence against women, lack of awareness, the list goes on. But this is a dawn of change, really, for women in politics. and this growth can be accelerated. So how do we get more women in politics? Apart from quotas, women can benefit from targeted training or financial support. Concrete policies to support working parents can help. Community programs can help foster leadership skills. And feminist policies can be introduced. They provide a framework for gender-related strategies. And they have immense potential. They've also become a growing trend. The latest case is Germany. It has released a feminist foreign policy. It aims to invest in gender equality through development policy. Some other countries have also introduced policies like these, like Sweden, Canada, France, Mexico. We know that politics does not work in isolation. It affects all facets of the society. So more women in politics means policies that help women everywhere, in all walks of life. Just by sheer inspiration, other areas could also see more women in leadership roles. It has a domino effect. Because you can't be what you can't see. Representation can make a world of difference. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution here, but there's plenty that can and should be done. And finally, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Japan. Tourists are coming back to Fukushima. Authorities are working hard to revive the tourism industry here. It was hard hit due to the pandemic and the aftermath of the nuclear disaster in Fukushima. In the US, people are still digging their way out of snow, and they're having fun with it. Some have pulled out their kayaks, while others are putting up free snow signs. Meanwhile, an Australian politician proposed to his partner during his speech in Parliament, and she said yes. And finally, women across the world rallied to mark the International Women's Day. We're leaving you with these visuals. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
And finally, I won't bring a ring out now because I'm not allowed to have any props, but it's securely stored at the moment, and I am planning, in fact, to bring it out very romantically tonight in the roughly 10 minutes between the kids falling asleep and us collapsing in exhaustion.
Mismanaged vaccination drive, broken healthcare systems, citizens taking matters into their own hands. India's failure in managing the COVID-19 crisis is staggering.
Want stories but without the West spin on it? Presenting Vantage with me, Palki Sharma, a first-of-its-kind global show with an Indian perspective.